Gear ratios and overdrive, underdrive are two of the numbers that are super useful to know. If you think you know how to calculate overdrive, stay tuned because there are multiple ways, 3 ways actually, to calculate overdrive. And each method will produce different numbers, all of which are mathematically correct. How's that for confusing? Well, I'm going to break it down, and I've even developed a super simple calculator that you can download and track all your vehicles and compare different setups. Before you forget, like and subscribe, but most importantly, turn on notifications so you won't miss any new video drops. First, let's look at the background math. This would be a typical overdrive situation on an RC crawler. The front wheels are turning faster than the rear wheels. Let's assume there is exactly 1.3 revolutions for every 1 revolution in the rear. Some people would call this 30% overdrive. However, there are 2 primary equations for expressing a change between 2 values. One is percent change, and the other is percent difference. They're similar but very different. There are actually 3 ways to calculate the difference between 2 numbers because percent change can either be a positive change, percent increase, or a negative change, also known as a percent decrease. Percent change, you have to specify whether it's an increase or a decrease. Percent difference is basically the average of the percent increase and the percent decrease, but it does not represent an actual physical property, meaning this is not the number of rotations one wheel is making relative to the other. Let's look at an example. 10 plus 1 equals 11. That's a 10% increase using the percent change formula. 11 minus 1 equals 10. That's a 9% decrease using the percent change. I'm doing a little bit of rounding just to keep it clear, but basically 10 and 11 are the 2 values, 11 and 10. One direction is a 10% increase, the other direction is a 9% decrease. Now let's use the percent difference formula and we get 9.5, basically the average of 10 and 9. The percent change formula best represents what's going on in real life. If your front wheels are spinning 1.3 times as fast as the rear wheels, you would call that 30% overdrive. That is a 30% increase in the front, but that's only from the perspective of the rear wheels. From the rear wheels looking forward, the front wheels are turning 30% faster, 30% more distance, 30% overdrive. The rear wheels are not turning 30% slower than the front wheels. This is not the same as 30% underdrive. If you're looking at the rear wheels from the perspective of the front wheels and you use the percent change formula, you would use the percent decrease version and the result would be 23% slower than the front wheel, or 23% underdrive. Exact same physical properties, 1 rotation versus 1.3 rotations, just a different way of looking at it, and a different number depending on your perspective. So this is why many companies and many people will use the percent difference formula, because it's harder to mess up. It's the same number regardless of how you're looking at it. You would get a 26% difference between the 2 wheels using the percent difference formula. Still, the exact same physical rotations, 1 and 1.3, but again, a different number that expresses the difference between those 2 values. The confusing part is that different people or companies might express overdrive using a different calculation method. For me, I like to know exactly which way it's being communicated so I can correctly predict how my car will react and compare apples to apples. So I've made this super simple tool that you can download and figure out all your gear ratios, underdrive, overdrive scenarios, and evaluate the different changes virtually before you commit to buying them. It's got all the different calcs in one place. To do any calculations, let's look at the components in your drivetrain that you'll need to know. So let's take a quick look at the inputs that you need to know. Let's start at the motor side of your drivetrain. The pinion gear is the small gear on your motor. The spur gear is the big one going into your transmission. I just love this classic RC10. I distinctly remember these aluminum bolts down here. Really cool. And I like the orange. If you have a mini transmission, you might not be able to see the spur gear to count the teeth. So you can normally look up the input spur gear tooth count from the manufacturer, or just peek inside and count the teeth on the first gear you see. The next step is to know the total gear reduction within the transmission. This is probably best looked up from the manufacturer. 4-to-1, 3-to-1 would be typical numbers for a transmission gear reduction, on an RC crawler that is. Next, you have 2 gears at each axle. These are bevel gears because they are 90 degrees to each other. This assembly might be called the differential, the pumpkin, the locker, etc. The bigger one is called the ring gear. The smaller one is called the pinion, and this is the one that's connected to your drive shaft. If you're driving a micro rig, an SCX24 for example, you may have worm gears at the axle, which is fine. The smaller worm gear will be on the drive shaft, and the bigger gear with teeth is on the axle. What you've got to do is look at the numbers printed on the gears. In this case, it's 13. That usually means it takes 13 rotations of the worm gear to turn the axle gear 1 revolution. And there is one small variation on the theme. If you see a 2/12, that actually means that there are 2 starts on the worm gear. There are 2 grooves or notches wrapped around each other, not just one. This means it takes 12 revolutions of the worm gear to rotate the gear axle twice, not once. The problem here is that Injora did not label these correctly, at least not in this current image. The number of leads should always be labeled like this. The bigger number is the tooth count for the flat gear. In this case, there are 2 leads and 12 teeth. If you look at the fine print, all of these Injora gears are actually 2-start worm gears, and only this one has a single start. They just didn't correctly label the 13, 14, and 16 tooth. An easier way to look at these ratios would be to put the actual reduction ratios. And they didn't put these in ascending order for some reason. This is infuriating. So sloppy. So now I put it in the right order. Fastest is at the top, slowest is at the bottom. This is the ascending order of the gear ratios, with the 112 being the absolute slowest and the 212 being the fastest. 212 is a 6-to-1 gear ratio, 216 is an 8-to-1 gear ratio, and 112 is a 12-to-1 gear ratio. This checks out because the 212 is half the gear reduction of the 112, meaning the gear with 2 starts is faster than the worm gear with 1 start, because it's moving twice the distance. Make sense? This might be a good image to screenshot for future reference. At least Mias has the good sense to label all their gears with a 2, meaning 2 screw threads. To get the actual gear ratio, you divide the 2 numbers. I feel like I'm really off in the weeds now. The real question is, what method are they using to calculate this overdrive and underdrive? We will get to that. Finally, if you're running portal axles, you will have 2 gears here. Sometimes they're the same size, but usually the top gear is smaller, which gives you an added gear reduction. So you've got your upper portal gear and your lower portal gear. Now we know all the terms, let me show you the tool. If you saw my video on center of gravity calculations, you will know that I published a Google Sheet template on my website. What I'm going to do is add this calculator to that. So if you already bought the center of gravity calculator, you will get an email and can download this additional calculator for free. Alternatively, if you're just buying the overdrive calculator now, you will get the CG calculator included, no charge. All of my calculation templates, past, present, and future ones I have planned, will be available all in one place. If you really like all the tools, you can also leave a super thanks, which should be down below here somewhere. Now, let me walk you through the overdrive gear reduction calculator tool. So you start by going to theboomslang.com and browse all, scroll down till you see it, and when you click on this, what you want to do is add to cart and purchase it, and then it will download to your computer. You want to make sure you remember where you saved it. Then in a Chrome browser, go to Google Sheets. Usually it's over here. You may have to scroll down to find it, but drag it up here and hit Google Sheets. And what you're going to want to do is open this file. You only have to do this once, but you hit open a file and you're going to upload it. And you're going to browse and navigate to wherever you saved it and then open the file. Once it's open, it will always appear in your menu here. It'll be saved to the cloud. You don't have to remember where you saved it any longer. It's in the cloud. It'll always appear in Google Sheets no matter what device you open it on. So then just click on the file to open it, and here you go. I'm going to just go through the tabs at the bottom here. This is the title page. At the end here we have version history, but you want to go to definitions, and these are just some pictures, some visual reminders of what all the variables are. And this page here is the primary page that you want to look at. You're going to input all your car's information right here, starting with the motor. This is the pinion tooth. This is the spur gear. Then you come over here to the transmission. These are all the variables that we just went through. The axle bevel gears and the portal gears if you have them. And I've put little flyouts here that will help remind you of what everything is. And if you're not using portal gears, just enter 1 in all of these categories. If you enter 0, you can't really divide by 0, so the equations fall apart. So just put 1. This would be for straight axles. Enter 1 in all these categories. And there's a little note right here that reminds you. Then all your results are down here. So I've organized this with front wheels and rear wheels, and you can copy this page as many times as you want. If you come down here and right-click, hit copy to, you can make a new spreadsheet and duplicate this tab so that you can do different vehicles. You can also rename this if you want to change it to each tab for a different vehicle, whatever you want to do. So as I was saying, there's a front wheel row and a rear wheel row. And first up, we have the total gear reduction for the front wheel and for the rear wheel. And right now, all the numbers are just the same in here. So let me just change this to, let's say this pinion is actually 932. That'll give us a differential down here. So now we have a front gear reduction is 43 to 1, and the rear gear reduction is 50 to 1. I put a note here, lower means faster. So that means the front wheels are turning faster, because it has a higher gear ratio. Even though this is a lower number, this is a higher gear ratio. This is a lower gear ratio. So the higher the number means the more gear reduction and the slower your vehicle is going to run. And again, I put a note right here to explain that, to remind you. And so this would be an overdrive scenario. There's less gear reduction in the front. So then I've put all the different ways you can calculate gear reduction right here. This is the front overdrive number, 16%. This is the rear underdrive number, 14%. Remember, we talked about how these numbers are different depending on which direction you're looking at the vehicle. This is the front wheel relative to the rear wheel. This is the rear wheel relative to the front wheel, 16%, 14%. Then you've got the percent difference, which is probably the more common way that people are going to communicate overdrive. But what I don't like about this is it's not an actual physical property of your vehicle. Your front wheels aren't actually turning 15% faster than the rear wheels. They're turning 16% faster. So this would be a more common number, but the percent change numbers, whether it's a percent increase or a percent decrease, are more meaningful numbers in my opinion. But I give you all the numbers so you can compare to whatever other numbers that you may see published. Now, another thing you can do is you don't have to calculate front wheel and rear wheel. You can do, let's say you just want to compare pinions. You could rename this And you don't have to rename it, but just for illustration purposes. So if you want to see what happens if you just change pinions, let's change this to a 12-tooth pinion. And then let's assume the rest of the drivetrain is the same, so we need to set it the same. Remember, we changed this previously, so let's put this back to 8 and 33. So now the only thing difference is the pinion, and this is now yellow is still yellow, blue is still blue. So this is no longer the front and the rear. What you're comparing now is a big pinion to a small pinion. And here you can see the difference in gear reduction coming from just the pinion. So down here, these percent changes become a little bit more complicated. You're not looking at the front versus the rear anymore. You're comparing a big pinion to a small pinion, and the percent difference between the two is 29%. So this just illustrates how going from a 12-tooth pinion on your motor to a 9-tooth pinion on your motor gives you a 29% difference in gearing. And one more example, again, you don't have to only compare front to rear. You could compare perhaps two different differential gears. Let me just rename these for clarity. Let's say I'm only changing my differential gear, and I want to know what difference that makes between just the differentials or the pumpkins. Let's say that pumpkin 1 is actually going to be 1029 instead of 833. That's going to give me a 26-to-1 gear ratio instead of a 50-to-1 gear ratio just in the pumpkins. So again, that's not front to rear, that's pumpkin 1 to pumpkin 2. So there are quite a few different ways that you can analyze your gear train from beginning to end, from motor to wheel, and evaluate what changes those are in your total gear reduction and also in your overdrive, underdrive. Again, one low price will get you all the current and future calculators at theboomslang.com, link in the description. Let me know how they work, and if you'd like to see any additional features, I'll see what I can do.